Good evening.
Hey Philip, how you doing?
I'm fine, thanks. And you?
I'm great, man. Thanks for I know it's what 6 over there. It's like a 6 or 7 hour time difference from over here. So I thank you for working with me and coming on.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So kind of before we start out, man, I want to kind of say how I came known of you was so a few years ago, um Calvin Parker, who is both of our good friend. I had scheduled a podcast with him to talk about his Pascagoula alien abduction story. All of a
Mhm.
sudden, out of the blue, I get this weird email and it's saying Calvin Parker, yada, yada. It gets this big, long thing. And I'm like, oh no, the government has heard me. They know exactly what's going on. And it happened to be you. So I've just been, so that's kind of how I became known of you, Philip. And we've switched emails constantly because you're signing people to your new your publishing company, publishing their books and trying to get them interviews, some of which I have interviewed. And so, again, thank you for coming on because you've written a book, and we're going to talk about some of that today.
Yeah, my pleasure, Dylan. I can assure you. Calvin's one extraordinary fella. He really is.
So before we jump into it, we mentioned Calvin. How did you become, known of Calvin? Did he reach out to you? Did you just see his story?
No, what it was, I obtained the rights to republish Charlie Hickson's book that he wrote with a chap called William Mendez, and that was published back in 1983. Of course, Mr. Hickson had passed away in 2011. But I didn't know, I thought that Calvin was still around, but didn't know where or how to find him. And I thought, it'd be nice just to get an interview with Calvin and maybe put it in the back of this book just to bring things up to date. So it took me about 3 months. And somebody finally said, oh, I have an old email for him. I think it still works. And I sent him it and he replied. And then I got his phone number. And when I phoned him, he was very polite, but it was just for an interview, nothing else. And, he talked, but he didn't say an awful lot. Unbeknown to me, a couple of weeks beforehand, he'd been to a friend's funeral and he signed a book of, I don't know, of condolence on the way out. And everybody's sort of nudging and winking. And his wife, Wynette, said, why don't you write a damn book and then everybody will know your story, So he said, yes, dear, no real intention of doing it, but just to placate the wife. And he said the same to me. And I thought, well, I haven't really contacted him about writing a book. I just want an interview. So I said, well, I could help you. So that was it. And we figured out the best way for him to write the book. And we did, and it, much to our amazement, it became a bestseller on Amazon, and we followed it up with another one, and we're still working on the case as we speak. So it started as an interview and ended up with two books with Calvin.
It's crazy. It started as an interview because you were interested in just aliens, for example. You're just so interested in the story, and then led to friendship, writing a book, closer friendship. Now there's like movies and TV shows. There's documentaries that's being made. Yeah. I mean, it's crazy. And here's the thing. And I'm Philip I wasn't too sure if he was telling the truth. When I went over there, that was my goal, was to hear his story, right? Yeah. And I was like, this guy's gonna lie. But I'm telling you, this guy told me the same exact story as he tells every other person that interviews him. And if you're going to make a story up, you're at least going to tell a couple of fibs along the way and forget that you told that fib. But he didn't. He was like straightforward, beginning to end and I was like, I believe you. It was either you did get abducted or you believe this so much that it's true to you. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it was just that straightforward.
Absolutely. And we've asked him, well, what do you make of people who don't believe you? He says, I just don't care. That's up to them, and he's a God-fearing man. He'd never even told his wife
Right.
the whole story. Him and Waynette were engaged at the time when this happened back in 1973, so he'd not even told her the full story. And he is a remarkable man. And like you said, we found out a lot more since then. New witnesses have come forward. There is a movie script that has been written. It's not been made yet, but that one is written. And we are making a brand new documentary series that starts filming in the States this September. And I've been working with a lady in the States called Dr. Irina Scott. She's in Ohio. And Irina and I will have another book out next year that we've written together. Calvin's written the foreword for us, but it's about all of our research that we've done. And and things still keep happening, Dylan. We still find out things to this very day, and where it will end, I have no idea. I mean, I read about the case first back in the early 80s in a magazine, and it was just an article, and it always kind of stayed with me. So when I started publishing, I actually went to buy a copy of Charlie's book. You could only get them secondhand, but they cost a fortune.
Right.
So I thought, well, I tell you what I'll do. I'll see if I can get the rights and republish it, and then people, if want the story, don't have to pay a fortune to get the book. So that's how that started. And Calvin and I were amazed that things, once his story was out and people were listening to him, and the media weren't making fun of him like they did back in 1973, then more people felt, I saw something that night, and they felt obliged to step forward and say, Calvin, this is what I saw, And then the town, a charity in the town raised some money, and they put a historical marker there detailing Charlie and Calvin's account, and it was officially opened, by the mayor. And there's a little piece on local news, and Calvin's even in tears standing by it, But a remarkable story and a remarkable man. It really is.
So your new book called UFO Landings UK, it's out now, and the book details hundreds of shocking UFO landings to have taken place from the 1900s to currently in the UK. So what I want to do, man, is I have some things, some stories that you talked about in the book that I would like to chat about here that I thought would be interesting for the audience, if you're down for that.
Absolutely, fire away.
So one of the stories in it, which I found was absolutely fascinating, was 1954. The first major UFO sighting in the UK was from a 13-year-old boy.
Yeah, I'm not sure which one you referred to because there are so many.
Right, the Stephen Derbyshire.
Oh, Stephen Derbyshire. Yeah, Derbyshire. Well, Stephen, in the 1950s, of course, not just in the UK, but across the world, it was all about the Space Brothers and, friendly aliens coming from wherever, the moon or Venus. It was the time of George Adamski. And Derbyshire took he said, I've seen one of these things on the ground, and took a photograph of it. And it was very much like, if you think back to the George Adamski photographs, his so-called scout ship, it was like that, but a bit out of, it was a bit out of focus with the pictures. And Stephen would relate this account, and it was one of those that made the headlines in the 1950s. And that it's one that's been, largely forgotten. Because when it comes to incidents of that nature, and we talk about Adamski and others, I remember not that long ago being asked, where did all the Space Brothers go? Because once we got the Kenneth Arnold thing out of the way and we moved into the 1950s, it was the contactees, as they were called. And, these beautiful Venusians, or I think George Adamski said they lived on the dark side of the moon, but of course they don't, there's nothing there.
Right.
And that was all part and parcel of it. And it made the headlines. I think I've even got some old newspaper cuttings where that account, it really did make the headlines. And a fascinating little story that I think, in all honesty, is one that's been long forgotten, as many of them in the book are. I've had a number of people say, I've never heard of this one. I never heard of that. Well, that's the whole purpose of writing the book in the first place.
Now, you mentioned there's I mean, many stories and accounts in the book, but how did you gain these stories? Because, back in the day, everything was done by word of mouth or just folk stories landing down. So how did you kind of see this and kind of pick the truth of what was true, what was false?
Yeah. Well, I started my involvement in this subject in 1980. I joined a local UFO group. I live in a county called West Yorkshire, and I lived just outside of the city of Leeds. And a local group started. They called themselves the Yorkshire UFO Society. It was founded by two brothers, Mark and Graham Birdsall. And I joined. And I haven't been involved that long when I did some local newspaper coverage. And a lady phoned us, and she said, Philip, you'll not believe us. Now, where I was born and raised, Dylan, was an industrial area. It was up nearly all coal mines, mills, factories. And she lived in a small town called Normanton, which was only a few miles from where I lived. And that was a big coal mining area. They've all gone now, so we went to visit this lady called Mrs. Westerman. And she lived in a terraced house, and it was a cul-de-sac, so there was no road going through. It stopped at the end. And at the end of the cul-de-sac were some trees, a little stream, and a hill. And her children were outside playing a ball game. It was a beautiful sunny day. And she was just in the house washing the dishes after lunch. One of them come running in, said, Mom, there's an airplane crashed in the field. So she came out the front door, and she lived in an elevator house, so you had to walk up half a dozen steps. And she could see out across this field. She said, Philip, it wasn't any kind of airplane. It was this Mexican hat-shaped thing on the ground. It was a silver gray color. So she got the children. She walked down the road, through the cul-de-sac, through the trees. You lose sight of this hill at this point. You come up the other side of the hill, and there's a fence bordering the field. And this thing was still there. But now there's three tall men all wearing a one-piece suit, all white. We call it a boiler suit here in the UK. I think you call it coveralls in the United States.
Okay.
They didn't have a helmet as such on. They had some kind of visor over their face. They had mittens, not gloves, and they were waving something over the ground. And one of the children started to climb the fence, but Mrs. Westerman held him back. And at this point, these three beings walked to the rear of this thing. It rolled silently into the air and stopped and shot off, and was gone. And she was bewildered. So we interviewed her and the children and some of the children's friends, and they never called it a spaceship or an alien or anything like that. And her husband was a coal miner, just like my dad. So I knew these kind of people, Dylan, and wasn't allowed to take a photograph, wasn't allowed to use her name. So at the end of the day, we came to you have two ways to look at this. They're either lying or they're telling the truth. Couldn't find any reason why they'd want to lie.
Right.
And had no reason to disbelieve them. So that started the ball rolling as far as UFO landing cases was concerned. So that one went into the files. And as the years progressed, I'd interview other people. I'd also speak to colleagues that had done their own investigations, and they would provide a copy of the file. And then, I may have some magazine articles. Like there used to be the Flying Saucer Review was a great source of information. So through my own investigations, through working with friends and colleagues, and other publications that I laid my hands on, the files started to get bigger and bigger and larger. And it was a few years back now. I thought, well, I better put all things in a book. But it just never happened, Dylan. I don't know why. I just never got around to it. And then, of course, came the pandemic.
Right.
And, couldn't go anywhere. So I thought, I've got no excuse now. And if anyone goes on Amazon to buy a copy of the book, they'll see the publication date. It actually says 2020. but it didn't come out in 2020. That's when I first uploaded the cover. And we were in the process of making a TV documentary based on the book, but that had to stop because of the pandemic. That's now finished, by the way, and hopefully that'll be out later this year. So I decided, I better release this thing, but, I can't leave it sitting here any longer. So I published it this year, and away we go. It's as simple as that. And there's some fascinating things in it, Dylan. There really is. And that, as you mentioned with Stephen Derbyshire, that's just one example. And when I was going through the files, there's even some that I'd collected, I'd forgotten about all, myself, because I hadn't, got these files out for years. I literally have an old filing cabinet right next to me, So most of them were in there in old paper format, but there was, thankfully, there was a few I saved in the what we would say the conventional way now, on the computer.
Uh-huh. So before we move on, I kind of want to go back these beings, I guess you could call it, with mittens and the visors, kind of looking like Devo. Yeah. What were they what were they trying? Were they trying to cover up something, or what was the point of being there? Is anybody sure?
Who knows? I mean, where this place is, Dylan, it's no disrespect to the town of Normanton, but there's a main motorway goes past here, highway, and you would never take any notice of Normanton. It's just a small little town. It was a mining town at the time. There's nothing unusual about it. Nothing spectacular. What's interesting is a couple of years back, I did a podcast for somebody when we were starting to talk about the book. Mm-hmm. And a couple of weeks later, a lady emailed me from New Zealand. And she said, what was the lady's name? Because for some reason, I just didn't use the name. And I said, oh, it was called Mrs. Westerman. She said, well, I'm an immigrant. I'm originally from England. I live in New Zealand now. She said, I used to live in Normanton. And she said, my best friend was called Westerman. So she emailed her best friend, and her best friend was one of those children I interviewed all those years ago. She now wasn't called Westerman because she got married and changed the name. So we got in touch with each other. She confirmed it all again. And then just literally a few weeks ago, I'd done some television work here in the UK, and a chap emailed me, and he said, my partner was one of the children that saw that thing. So he gave me his partner's name and telephone number, and I rang her up. And she said, yeah, the girl that I'd spoken to a couple of years back, I won't mention her real name, I'll call her Susan. She says, I was her best friend, and we were out playing outside when we saw that thing. She gave me a full account of it on the phone. She doesn't live near here now. She lives a long way from here, but she confirmed it all once again. So even all these years later, we have, further confirmation, if you like. But what was behind this encounter? And we've run this story in our local press, our local newspapers here a couple of times. Mm-hmm. Nobody else has ever come forward. And that puzzled Mrs. Westerman. She thought, I'll sit down tonight and it will be on my TV news, the local news, nothing. I'll buy the newspaper. It's bound to be in there. Not a thing. She even asked some of her neighbours if they'd seen anything, because it was a lovely, summer, sunny day, people out and about, nothing whatsoever. And so, like with all the cases in the book, I allow people to draw their own conclusions. All I can say is I have no reason to disbelieve these people at all,
right?
And I'll make of it what you will.
Yeah. So you mentioned growing up, and I was, listening to a couple of your interviews, and we kind of grew up somewhat, I think similar in the fact that when you would go to church, you didn't understand something, so you would actually fully think of a really difficult question that makes sense to you, and so you would ask a question. And you were practically told, like I was, you're questioning the Bible. Stop questioning what you're being told and believe it. And and that's the thing that puzzles me is why am I not allowed to ask a question that to make me understand it? Because I was always, was told that, but it was also they would give me some sort of not like a dumb answer, like it wouldn't make any sense to perhaps the question that I even asked.
Yeah, I mean, I always had that personality.
Right.
It wasn't at church. This was at high school. It wasn't
Okay.
a church school we went to. That we had one lesson a week.
Okay.
And it was called not religious education, but religious instruction. And they would just tell you about the Bible. And I can't remember the teacher's name, but I can see him. And he was an awful man. He really was an
Yeah.
awful,
Yeah.
bad-tempered person. And you're thinking, and he'd be telling you the story about the Bible. And, my hand, I try to keep it down, Dylan. I try, but the hand would go up. And I even, we had a Bible at home. My mum was a Christian, and I read the Bible. I thought, I'm getting into trouble for this, so I better read it and find out what's the big deal. So I did. It took me a year, maybe. I didn't read it all in one go. And, and so I've always had that kind of questioning attitude. And that comes from my mum. She always taught me, if you don't know something, you just ask. That's the only way you'll find out. I'll give you another example. I worked in industry for the biggest part of my life. And the factory I worked in, a chap was teaching me how to run this huge, great plant we worked on. Took several of us to run it. I'm going to the boring bits of it. And he said, at one point you flick this lever and you lift this roller up. I think it was for about 17 seconds. And then after 17 seconds, you flick it and put it down again. And I said, okay. I mean, any idiot can do that. So I said, why 17 seconds? And he says, Philip, I've been teaching people to run this plant for 10 years, and you're the only one that's ever asked me that question. Everybody else just said, okay, and you just does it and doesn't ask up. So that was the same when I got into the UFO subject, Dylan. I thought, rather naively, I may suggest, I'll read a few books, I'll ask some questions, I'll write a few letters maybe. And of course, I'll get all the answers I want in no time. And well, this is, 40 plus years ago. And I'm still reading the damn books. still don't write so many letters now. I send emails instead. But so I always had that attitude. I wanted to know more. And I wanted to know why, who, what, why, where, when, and all this kind of thing. And, I think it's just the way I am. And obviously you understand, you're probably like that yourself.
100%. I'm always, because even the 17 seconds is like, well, why such an odd number? Why can't it be just a quick 20 seconds or 10 seconds? Why does it have to be 17? Is something going to happen if I would ask, because I'd be like, well, if I'm half a second late and I turn on 18 seconds, am I going to die? What's going to happen? That would be my thought about it, is why 17 exactly?
Well, I'll give you an example. On this plant, we had a big control panel on it with all lights flashing and all this kind of stuff.
Right.
And we had a new foreman coming to work on it. And he was a nice guy, but don't get me wrong, but he wasn't the cleverest of guys. So from an old machine that was wrecked, we had a big emergency stop button. It's just a green box with a big red button on it.
Right.
And what we did, we stuck it on the side of the control panel with some tape.
Uh-huh.
And we told him that he had to press this button every 15 minutes. Otherwise, the whole plant would stop dead and cause thousands of pounds of damage. So even during his lunch break, he was looking at his watch and he'd get up and go and press this button. And he'd been doing it for 3 days. And bear in mind, we used to work 12-hour shifts. So it was 4 times an hour he's pressing this damn thing. When the manager came down and saw him press this button and thought, what's he doing? And he just went and pulled the damn thing off the side of the control panel. And, there was the difference. This guy was, again, it was like I say, a great guy, but if you told him to do something, he would do it and not question it.
Yeah.
And that was our way of saying, should you really, it's not his fault, but are you really promoting the right people to these positions?
Right.
So, but if that had been me, I'd have said, well, what will happen if I don't press it? And then, of course, they would have fallen about laughing then, you know what I mean? It didn't work. But so, when we started to interview, UFO witnesses, like I said, I was very naive to begin with, but thankfully, I think I was a quick learner. You learn to ask questions. Something would happen, so you'd learn next time to ask this question or say, "What about this? What about that?" And it's the same with Calvin Parker. We mentioned Calvin right at the beginning. We had Calvin's story, and then we started, other people started coming forward. So we started asking questions. Well, what about this? What about that? And it's led to a whole lot of new information that none of us knew was out there. And it's only because of, somebody kept saying, "Well, how do you find out all this information, Philip?" I said, "Just ask."
Right. Just ask. Yeah.
Just ask. It is that simple. It's nothing complicated. Just ask the question.
Just what are they going to do? Not answer it or hang up on you, leave the room? What's the worst that can happen?
Yeah, well, it's like with Calvin. When I first started working with him, I said, "Have you got any photographs?" He said, "No." He said, "My house was engulfed in Hurricane Katrina.
Mhm.
Everything gone.
Mhm.
Even family photographs of his children, So one of the things I set about while he's writing the manuscript is to pester the living daylights out of people. And I thought, well, who was around back in 1973? So I just started emailing. "I'm working with Calvin Parker. Have you got anything on the Pascagoula case of 1973? And people sent things. Others just said, "Sorry, Philip, no." And it's amazing what we acquired in no time at all. And we still do it now. And I say, I've probably asked you this before, so I apologize in advance, because I don't keep a list of people I've pestered, but things just crop up. For example, we found out that Charles Hickson was hypnotized, regressed twice by the late Bud Hopkins in the 1980s.
Mhm.
One in 1983 and 85, I think it was. So the next question was, well, Bud's gone, he's no longer with us. Where are his archive? Well, his archive is with Dr. David Jacobs. Well, does he have a tape? Yeah, so we've got the tapes of Charlie's hypnosis. Then Calvin was hypnotized by Bud Hopkins in 1993. Right. Calvin had another encounter, so we got that tape. And so we went round and round and gathering more and more information and more material. And that's the same with any case. Just ask the questions, and just be patient. You don't have to have all the answers straight away, and just keep at it.
Yeah, man. So with all these, cases and the abductions that you studied, I gotta know, what is the percentage of people seeing the same type of alien or unidentified object versus seeing anything's different? Because I'm pretty sure there's different, I'm going to say breeds, like dog breeds. I'm pretty sure there's multiple breeds or variations of aliens.
Well, the thing about cases in Britain, I mean, we are pretty much like the States. We're a multiracial, multi-ethnic country.
Right.
I mean, if you go back to prehistory, the first people that ever lived in Britain were of Germanic origin. There was no Germany then, it was across in Europe. And then, of course, we had the Vikings live here for several hundred years. They came from throughout Europe. Then we had the Vikings, they came throughout Scandinavia. And then later on we had the Normans, and then we had the British Empire. So we had there's a mixture of us. And it's the same when it comes to the UFO encounters. One of the things about UFO landings UK, when you look at the beings that are reported, they are very, very different. I'll give you one example. As you know, Britain is made up of England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales.
Right.
So we're four countries all joined together. In Wales, Wales has its own language, by the way. And there's a town called, I can't pronounce it, but I'll give it a go, Machynlleth. It's a strange sounding name because that's the Welsh name for it. And in July 1975, a young boy called Trevor, he went down to the beach there with his father. And behind the beach were some rocks. So he just said, "Dad, is it all right if I go and play on the rocks. Yeah. Dad sat on the local beach, and off he goes. He climbs up this rocks, and when he reaches the summit, Trevor sees this circular thing on the ground. It's got lights going around it. It's got a dome. But the most bizarre thing is the figures that are in it. There are two figures, and you can see an outline of them, but the interior is almost like, it's difficult to explain, like molten lava. It's all mixing and squirming and squiggling. So he runs down the rocks to his dad and says, Dad, there's a flying saucer. And off he goes again. And his dad's thinking, what's he on about? And his father could see Trevor at the top of these rocks. He's actually behind a rock, and he keeps bobbing up and down like this. He's watching these things. He's hiding behind the rock, and then they're gone. And, I've looked in the UFO literature to see if I could find anything similar to these. I call them jelly men, because I don't really know what to call them, but I can't find anything else. And it is a really bizarre little case that, again, most people will never have heard about. It is really, really bizarre. One of the things I keep mentioning in the book is high strangeness. Yes. It comes from Dr. Alan Hynek. In other words, the closer you get to these things, the more people that witness it, et cetera, the less likely it's a mistaken identity. We all know if somebody sees a little light in the distance, some miles away, it can be a whole host of things.
Right, yeah.
So we use Hynek's high strangeness, and all these cases have their own layers of high strangeness, and that is one of them, very bizarre indeed, very bizarre. So it's same comes with abduction cases. I was undecided whether to put all out abduction cases in this book or just stick with landing cases, but there is a couple. And there's one as a lady in Manchester, and it's a long story, so I won't go into it. I mean, I've met her several times. She lives at a place called Didsbury in Manchester. And I asked her to describe her encounter. How did you feel? She was with her children at the time. And she used one word. And she said, biblical. That's how this whole encounter made her feel. Because we've always talked, you'll see a flood somewhere and they'll say it was a flood of biblical proportions, or, that she used it in that sense. It kind of gave me hairs stuck up on the back of my neck when I heard her say it. And so she's one of the abduction cases in the book as well, because this thing came down and landed as well. And it's just mind-boggling as far as I'm concerned. I can't figure it out.
What was the takeaway when she heard biblical? What was the first thought in your head when she said, "Oh, the experience was biblical"?
I knew what she meant, kind of, even though I've never had this type of experience, because things that are of such a magnitude, they're often referred to as biblical. Like the Great Flood, it was biblical in proportions. She didn't mean it as this was a a religious event. This wasn't beings from this wasn't God or angels. It was the whole thing wrapped into one. It was biblical. It was so immense to her. That's and they call her Linda Jones. Linda's a lovely lady. Met her husband and fascinating stuff. And so when you talk about similarities, there isn't an awful lot. There are some, of course there are, but there's probably more differences than there are similarities. And there are some weird and wonderful things. High strangeness is rather than weird and wonderful. And Linda is one example of those.
I'm curious because I'm always curious about people that. So what is your studies with Men in Black, if there are any?
Well, there is one in Linda's account that, you'll call it a Men in Black, but it's not something we've come across in any great detail at all.
Okay.
And I think on some occasions, when people have reported Men in Black. I'm talking about here in the UK. I think they've just got
Yes.
mixed up. I'll give you an example. I think these were genuine curiosity seekers. I mentioned Mrs. Westerman and the things landing at Normanton and the Mexican hat-shaped thing.
Uh-huh.
When I spoke to this lady just a few weeks ago, she was one of the children playing outside that day, was Mrs. Westerman's children's friend. And she says, you know, Philip, 2 scientists turned up and interviewed her. Well, they didn't. The 2 people she's referring to is me, my colleague from the Yorkshire UFO Society.
Okay.
She didn't know that. She genuinely, thought that 2 people had turned up and interviewed, which was right. It was me and my colleague, Mark Birdsall. But then she'd used her own imagination down the years, and that had changed from to being scientists. We weren't scientists, never pretended to be scientists. So if I were not here and she's telling that story to someone else, they'd say, oh, 2 scientists turned up, dun, dun, dun. But in reality, they didn't. It was me and a colleague. So I think sometimes that happens as well. It's just a genuine mistake. So not come across anything Men in Black wise that I could really put my finger on, if I'm honest.
A couple more things that I want to hit on before we get off here, because we're running short on our hour time limit we have here. So one more story that I want to hit on from the book is one that I found probably to be the creepiest of all the stories, is the Decmont Woods abduction.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was Robert Taylor. So we're talking, late 1979. I met Mr. Taylor some years after the event, but my colleague Malcolm Robinson was there within a day. And Mr. Taylor lived in a small town in Scotland called Livingston. It lies between Edinburgh and Glasgow. Small town, and he was a forestry worker. And he's going to work one morning, gets in his truck with his dog, going to a place just on the edge of the town called Decmont Woods. It's not a huge great forest or anything like that. Parks the truck, walking down through the woods, and he comes across a small clearing. And in this clearing is a dome-shaped object, either just above or on the ground. It has a band around its bottom part. He calls it a flange. It's a band around it, has these little things sticking up that are a bit like the old-fashioned props, propellers. And he's stunned. And as he's watching this thing, these 2 balls either come from behind it or from underneath it, and they have spikes on it, a bit like he calls them like the mines, the sea mines were during the Second World War. And it's damp. It's November, so it's wet. I mean, it's always wet in Scotland anyway. Mm-hmm. And you can literally hear these things sticking in the ground. They're making a plopping noise as they roll towards him.
Like a plunger noise, like a toilet plunger noise, like it's sticking.
Yeah,
off.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. He feels a tug on either side of his trousers about thigh level, and he passes out. He comes around, his dog is doing cartwheels. He hears this whistling noise. He has a strong smell of ammonia or sulfur, and this thing is gone. He staggers up, tries to drive his truck, but he drives it into a ditch. So he staggers down home, literally. His wife opens the door, and he's got mud on his face. And she says, what's happened? He says, I've been attacked. So she phones the police. Her husband's been attacked. They come, Mr. Taylor tells them the story. They notice that his trousers are ripped. And these are the sort of heavy woolen trousers you wear for working outside. They go to the location. There are marks in the ground, it's like 2 tractor marks, and there's these these U-shaped indentations. So they cordon off the area. It's cold that night, so it freezes the ground, so it protects these indentations. Mm. The police photograph them, measure them, they do a drawing of it, and they launch a full-scale investigation. This is a forensic investigation. They take Mr. Taylor's trousers, study them, and they are consistent. The tears on them are consistent with what he said. He felt as if he was being pulled from the side and upwards. Mm-hmm. And it's the only police investigation of a UFO landing, a forensic investigation. Mm-hmm. And I have the full forensic report. I put one page of it in the book, along with some photographs of these indentations and the drawings and what have you. And I met Mr. Taylor. He'd retired when I met him. I've been to Deckmont Woods, and he was a really down-to-earth gentleman. Sadly, he's no longer with us. But he just, again, told the story. My colleague Malcolm Robinson wrote a whole book about this one case, but it is truly fascinating. And one of the things that we kind of miss out, Mr. Taylor also said, when you see this dome on the top, it wasn't transparent as such, but it did have some transparency to it. But this transparency moved. So it was, you know, it wasn't always in the same place. What that means, I don't know. It's just a little quirky little detail that often gets missed out or forgotten. But a fascinating case, and you know, Mr. Taylor appeared in, you know, on television and the newspapers talking about it, and he was, you know, was well-respected gentleman. Again, no reason to make such a story up. But as you're right, it is another fascinating account from the whole book.
You know, when people ask you, they interview you, they ask you questions, or they just see you in general and they know you're the UFO guy, you're the alien guy. What is the one thing people want to know about aliens? Like, what's the one thing that they're like, oh, we have to know about this?
Well, a lot of these people are looking for their own answers, Dylan. Like Calvin, they're looking for their own answers. And, you know, there's a number of these individuals who said, you know, are hoping that somebody like me will be able to tell them what's happened to them. And sadly, I can't.
Right.
So they're looking for answers. Some of them don't want to go public, which I understand. But there are others who think, no, I know I might get a bit of ridicule and a bit of, you know, leg pulling, but this is important. People need to know about this, you know. So some of them feel obliged, if you like. So with Charlie and Calvin, you had both. You had Charlie who wanted to tell people, he thought it was that important, whereas Calvin didn't want anybody to know. He ran away from it for 40 odd years, you know, and used to get angry with Charlie when he appeared on television. He said, wish that man had shut his damn mouth up, you know, stop talking about it. So there's a mixture of things, but there are some who think that, you know, by speaking to me or colleagues, that we might have some answers. And, you know, but not only that, sometimes, of course, as I'm sure you're aware, they've been ridiculed. You know, who do you go to? If something like this happens to you, who do you tell? You know, tell your family. You know,
they're gonna think you're crazy. They're gonna be like,
yeah.
Why do you want so much attention? Why do you want to be center?
Yeah.
That's what they're going to say.
So sometimes they're just grateful. We're almost like an unpaid counselor, you know, that they can actually tell us their story without us, you know, laughing or making any form of judgment whatsoever. And they've got it off their chest. You know, at last, I've got somebody to sit down in front of me and just listen. And so I think that's an important part of your role as a UFO researcher, stroke investigator as well, is that with some of these individuals, they just want to get it off their chest. Again, Calvin said, I wish I'd have done this years ago now, Philip. I said, well, you know, we've done it now, and that's it. It's changed his life completely. And some people think, well, right, I want to speak to others of a similar nature, see if they can help. Calvin did that. He went to do a TV show once, and the only reason he went to do it is because Betty Hill was on it. And he thought, Betty's been through the experience. Maybe I can learn from her how to help. Mm-hmm. And he went and spent 3 days at her home with her, and didn't help him at all, he said. But, you know, he tried in that respect. So there's a whole number of things, but a lot of them are just grateful that they've had somebody to tell, you know, and that's no different today than it was 40, 50 years ago.
Last two questions for you, and I'll let you go. First one would be, what is one thing or something that you've studied? Because I'm pretty sure you've done a lot more studies than a lot of other people that are interested in this, that you have figured out about these aliens or these beings that not a lot of people would know.
Oh, I don't know if that's me that's
Okay.
figured any of that out. What I
Okay.
did find in my first book back in the 1990s was called Without Consent, and it's all about alien abductions.
Okay.
Okay. And this is pre-internet days. So when I went to interview people, I wrote it with a colleague of mine called Carl Negatis. Carl was a well-known journalist at the time. And I literally drove from one end of the country to the other, interviewing people, as many as I could face to face. What I did learn is that, you know, these people are just like you and I. There's nothing different. You could put these people in a room and they wouldn't stand out. So whatever these experiences are, they do happen. On what level, I don't know, but they do take place, and there is no way of forecasting it. It is any place, anytime, anywhere. It literally is. And there is this argument about whether to use hypnosis or not to use hypnosis. And I understand the argument. All I would say is that the hypnotic testimony doesn't differ radically from those who have full conscious testimony, you know, full conscious recollection. And there is no age group, there is no location, you know, for any of these accounts that would stand out more than anything else. But nonetheless, these experiences do take place. Even the skeptics would say, yes, they do, but they'd probably come up with an explanation for them.
Mhm.
There is no, as far as I'm concerned, there is no one explanation that can cover all these experiences. So, it's just like you and I. You go to your, I don't know, your service station tonight and fill up your car, and the lady you pay on the checkout, it could have happened to her. It could be anybody, and you wouldn't know. You would not know. That's you know, the biggest lessons I've learned. You think you're going to find out things, but you soon learn. No, like I said, when I first started, I'll read a few books and write a few letters, and I'll find all the answers. But it doesn't. I wish it was that easy.
Last question for you is, and we're going to leave the podcast on an open-ended question, I guess you could call it. Do you think we or the world will ever make contact with these aliens and kind of figure out exactly what they are and become one with them?
Difficult question. That's assuming that the phenomenon is alien in the first
Right.
instance, of course.
Assuming, yes.
Let's assume it is. All I would say is, you know, we as a species, because we as Homo sapiens have not been around for long.
Right.
You know, when we look at the recent images from the James Webb Space Telescope, it's shown that the universe is much larger and much more complex than we ever imagined. So, you know, alien life may be in abundance throughout the universe, but it is just so far away. And it's not just the distance, it's the fact that it could have been around a lot longer than us.
Mhm.
Therefore, if we're to meet face to face, we wouldn't probably recognize it. The late science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke said if we encountered aliens, they would look to us as if magic. In other words, we wouldn't be able to figure out what the hell was going on, because they would have to be so far in advance. And if we can do that on our own planet, the next most intelligent species on this planet are the dolphins. And we can teach a dolphin to catch a fish. We can't communicate with it. Can't call it Flipper. And how's the wife today? You know, where you going on your holidays? What do they see when they see us? Are we so far in advance that they can't figure out what the hell's going on? All they know is that every now and again, if they jump up in the air, they'll get a fish. You know,
Right.
So could be the same. It could be that the answer is right there at the end of our nose, but as a species, we're just not clever enough to figure it out yet. Maybe we never will be. Who knows?
Philip, man, I appreciate you coming on here and being on for this hour that we're booked. So the book UFO Landings UK, that's available Amazon, anywhere you get books.
Yeah, Amazon's always the place. It's in hardback, it's in softback, it's audio book, Kindle, take your pick, you know, and I'm sure you'll not be disappointed.
Philip, thank you very much for joining the show, and I'm very grateful
My
that you were
pleasure.
on. And I look forward
pleasure.
to
Thank
and I
you.
look and I look forward to all your emails coming through and getting to read some of these books that a lot of people won't get to read unless they purchase them. It's crazy to see their stories and be like, yeah, let's talk to them. And so I appreciate you doing that, and hopefully you keep sending them my way.
Thank you very much. Will do.
Thank you, Philip. All right, you have a good one, man.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.